The word saloon brings to mind clinking glasses, laughter spilling out into the dusty streets, and hearty plates of roasted meat served beside steaming pies. Maybe you picture thick steaks grilled to perfection, golden potatoes, and fresh cornbread, still warm from the oven. Hollywood made sure of that. In every Western film, the saloon is more than just a bar. It's a rustic haven of comfort in the middle of a brutal world. But what if we told you the real scent that greeted you at the door wasn't baked bread or roasted meat, but a mixture of sweat, unwashed bodies, spilled liquor, moldy food, and horse dung drying just outside? That the saloon was not a culinary refuge, but a place where hunger met desperation. The truth is simple and ugly. Most Wild West saloons didn't serve meals at all. Those that did often offered food as an afterthought, something secondary to the main business, getting men drunk enough to forget how miserable their lives were. The plates that came out of those back rooms weren't crafted by skilled chefs or warm-hearted innkeepers. They were thrown together by whoever was sober enough to hold a spoon and angry enough to take the job. There were no menus, no standards, and certainly no health codes. What mattered was that it filled your stomach, not that it tasted good or safe. Forget about steaks unless you were rich. For the average cowboy or miner, the best you could hope for was beans that had been reheated so many times they were more ash than food, or chunks of salted meat tougher than the soles of your boots. You might be lucky to get a piece of dry bread and a smear of lard. That was dinner, and you were expected to be grateful, especially if it came with a half-clean spoon. The air inside most saloons didn't carry the comforting scent of fried onions or stew. It reeked of rot. Barrels of pickled goods spoiled under the wrong temperature. Meat hung too long in the open air, attracting flies and bacteria. Water for cooking was often pulled from nearby wells or rivers, polluted by livestock, waste, and runoff. It wasn't unusual for a stew to taste suspiciously metallic, not because of exotic spices, but because the pot hadn't been cleaned properly in days, or weeks. There were no fresh vegetables unless you were in a rare farming town with a functioning supply chain. Most of the time, greens were boiled to mush or came from cans that had sat too long on hot shelves. Fruit, if it arrived at all, was bruised, fermented, or riddled with worms. Pies existed, but only in places where there was enough sugar and lard to make them. And even then, the crusts were often so hard you could chip a tooth. And yet, people kept coming. They ate what was put in front of them because they were starving. After riding for days through dust storms, after digging in mines for hours on end, after herding cattle without rest, any food was better than none. Hunger dulled the senses, made the smell tolerable, turned sour broth into something close to relief. You didn't complain, not if you wanted to be served again. The man behind the counter had a short fuse and a long knife, and the cook in the back wasn't known for second chances. So, no, saloons weren't places of indulgence. They were places of compromise. You didn't go there for flavor. You went because your body demanded fuel, and the saloon, for all its grime and grime-covered tables, was sometimes the only place with something warm to swallow. And what you swallowed might stay down, or it might not. Either way, it was a gamble you took with every bite. The romance of the Wild West ends at the threshold of the real saloon door. Step inside, and the truth hits you before the food does. A mix of desperation, grease, and heat, settling deep into the wood and the walls. This wasn't a feast, it was survival on a plate, and it was only the beginning. Inside the walls of a Wild West saloon, the line between welcome and warning wasn't drawn with signs or menus. It was etched into every glance, every coin tossed on the counter, and every pair of boots that crossed the threshold. Not everyone who walked in hungry walked out fed. And for those who did, what they ate, and what it said about them, revealed far more than just their appetite. The cowboy was a common sight, sure, covered in dust, saddle sore, exhausted after weeks on the trail. But despite the myth of him being a rugged American icon, in the saloon he was just another broke laborer, often eyed with suspicion. If he had coin, real coin, not promises scrawled on paper, he might be served something warm, maybe a scoop of beans, maybe a crust of bread. But if he walked in with only sweat on his brow and stories in his mouth, he'd be met with silence or a muttered insult. The barkeep didn't run a charity, he ran a business, and no one ate for free. Miners came in blackened with coal or white from lime dust, carrying the weight of days spent underground. They were loud, aggressive, flush with cash one week and broke the next. If they hit a decent vein, they ordered big, or tried to. They shouted for beef, for whiskey, for food that reminded them of the homes they'd left behind. But even when their pockets were full, their plates didn't always reflect it. Saloons weren't eager to serve up quality meals to rough men with quick fists. They'd be overcharged for whatever scraps were left, served fast, hot, and often foul. Then came the farmers, when they could spare the time and coin. Weathered, quiet, and usually sober, they weren't flashy, but they were consistent. If a saloon had a loyal customer, it was often a local farmer coming in after market, looking for something plain and filling. They weren't troublemakers, which is why they often got better treatment, a little more meat, a cleaner cup, a quiet place to sit. Not out of kindness, but because they weren't likely to shatter a window or start a brawl. The drifters and wanderers, men with no names and nothing to lose, occupied the edges. They lingered by the door, hoping for a dropped crust or a bartender in a forgiving mood. Most were turned away with a look or a gesture. Some begged, some stole. Others offered to work for food, sweeping, hauling barrels, anything. Sometimes it worked, most times it didn't. Hunger followed them out the door like a shadow. And then there were the ones no one talked about openly. The ones who did get the good stuff. The gamblers in tailored vests. The corrupt lawmen with slick mustaches. The madams who ran the upstairs rooms and the politicians passing through on horseback entourages. These people didn't sit at cracked tables with splinters and flies. They ate in the back, behind curtains, from separate pots and pans, cleaner, richer, safer. Their meals had salt, butter, even spices. Their meat didn't smell sour. Their drinks didn't come with a warning. The kitchen treated them differently because their coin was louder and more dangerous to offend. Children, if any wandered in, were often chased out before they reached the counter. Women, unless they worked there, were rare, and even rarer were the ones treated with dignity. The saloon was a man's world, and even within that world, it was survival of the richest, or at least the least offensive. Food in the saloon wasn't distributed by hunger, it was distributed by hierarchy. The harder your life, the worse your plate. And yet, people kept coming, hoping that maybe today the cook wouldn't notice how dirty their shirt was. Maybe today the bartender would forget last week's unpaid tab. Maybe today they'd get a real meal. But the truth was always waiting at the bottom of the bowl. The saloon fed who it wanted, and if you weren't wanted, no amount of hunger could change that. The kitchen of a Wild West saloon wasn't a kitchen in the way most imagine it. There were no polished counters, no rows of clean utensils, no cheerful cook humming over a bubbling pot. It was a smoky, suffocating back room, part storage, part war zone, where food was not so much prepared as endured. Everything reeked of urgency, grease, and danger. Fires burned too high, or not at all. Knives dulled by weeks of overuse clattered beside half-scraped cutting boards. And the people working there, they weren't culinary professionals. They were whoever hadn't quit yet or hadn't been stabbed. The man behind the stove, and yes, it was usually a man, didn't wear a white apron or a chef's hat. He wore an old shirt soaked in sweat and a short temper that could flare with little provocation. He wasn't there because he loved to cook. He was there because no one else would take the job, or because he owed the saloon owner more than money. Some had cooking experience from the army. Others just knew how to heat something without poisoning half the town, though that wasn't always a guarantee. Hygiene was not a concept that applied. Water, when available, was fetched in buckets from whatever stream or well was closest, regardless of whether livestock had wandered through it earlier that day. Soap was rare, scrubbing was minimal, hands were wiped on shirts already crusted with meat juices and ash. Spoons might go from one mouth to the next without a rinse, and cutting boards were often shared between raw meat and old bread without a second thought. The stoves themselves, usually made of cast iron and fueled by wood or coal, belched smoke into the room with every shift in the wind. Chimneys clogged, fires flared unexpectedly. Burnt food was a regular part of the smell in any saloon, and smoke clung to the ceiling beams like a permanent ghost. More than one cook had been partially deaf from years of metal pans crashing, pots boiling over, and shouted threats echoing through narrow walls. Rodents were constant companions. Cats, half wild, underfed, and aggressive, slinked between crates, hoping for scraps or catching rats that had grown fat on spilled grain and grease puddles. Some days, the cats fought. Other days, they disappeared, and the meat stew tasted a little different. No one asked questions. Floors were always wet or sticky. Mud tracked in from boots mixed with spilt beer and food scraps, forming a layer that never quite dried. Insects came in waves, crawling across shelves, hiding in corners, or buzzing around the light. If a dish was left uncovered for more than a minute, it had visitors. If it was covered, it was usually with a rag that hadn't been washed in weeks. Every meal was a game of chance. Was the beef from yesterday or last month? Did the beans get washed? Did the bread bake through, or is it raw in the middle again? The cook didn't always know, and didn't care. The priority was speed, not safety. Most customers were too drunk or too hungry to complain, and those who did, they either got silence or a stare from someone with a cleaver in one hand and a scarred knuckle in the other. Behind every plate served in a saloon was a chaotic storm of heat, noise, and rot. It wasn't a place where recipes were followed or pride was taken. It was a space barely held together by sweat and habit, where food was pushed out like ammunition, fast, hot, and sometimes deadly. The kitchen didn't run on skill, it ran on fumes, and at any moment it could erupt. In fire, in violence, or in sickness, no one could stop. There was no printed menu in a Wild West saloon, no chalkboard with daily specials, no waiter listing options with a smile. If you asked what was cooking, the answer was often a grunt and the clang of a ladle hitting the bottom of a pot. You didn't come to eat what you wanted. You ate what was left, what hadn't spoiled yet, or what could be disguised with enough salt and pepper to numb the taste. The main dish in most saloons was a thick, greasy stew that boiled endlessly at the back of the kitchen, absorbing whatever the cook had on hand. One day it might include dried beef, the next day a few questionable potatoes, and sometimes even a handful of barley if someone had traded well. But the meat was never fresh. It was usually salt beef, dried, packed in barrels, preserved with so much brine it could outlast a winter. The salt soaked through every bite, making it chewy, rubbery, and tough to swallow without a drink. Beans were everywhere, baked, boiled, fried. It didn't matter. They were cheap, they stored well, and they filled a man's stomach like wet cement. You could eat a bowl of beans and feel full for hours, even if the taste was bland or sour. But even beans went bad if left in damp sacks or cooked with dirty water. They became mushy, slimy, bitter. Still, they were served, often without apology. Cornbread was common too, though rarely golden or fluffy. It was dense, dry, and sometimes charred on the outside from uneven cooking. Made with cheap cornmeal and little else, it crumbled apart in your hands and turned to dust in your mouth. Butter, if you got it, came in grayish lumps. And forget about milk, unless you wanted it diluted with water and tasting faintly of tin. Jerky hung behind counters like old leather. It was hard enough to chip a tooth on, but it kept you alive. Chewing it took time and effort, which some claimed helped you forget how little flavor there really was. Still, it was better than nothing. When stew ran out or you didn't trust the soup, jerky was the fallback. Dried meat, dried beans, dried bread. Your jaw never caught a break. Fresh vegetables were rare and seasonal. Carrots soft and rubbery. Onions already sprouting. Tomatoes that smelled more like mold than food. If they were added to a dish, it was often to cover up something worse. The smell of old meat. The bitter tang of rot. Spices were used, but not for flavor. Pepper and chili powder masked spoilage. Salt preserved and distracted. Vinegar was poured over rancid items to buy another day of shelf life. And through it all, food was never about enjoyment. There were no compliments to the cook, no savoring of the flavors, no seconds unless you paid double. Meals were fast and forgettable, something you forced into your body because you had to ride at dawn, or because you hadn't eaten in 3 days. You didn't linger at your plate, you didn't ask what it was, you just chewed, swallowed, and hoped it stayed down. In a saloon, food didn't warm the heart, It quieted the growl in your gut. It wasn't comfort, it was calculation. How long will this keep me upright? How far can I ride before I need more? Every bite was utilitarian, a means to an end. You weren't feeding the soul, you were just buying time. And in the Wild West, time was the only thing more scarce than taste. Not all saloon plates were created equal. While most men hunched over bowls of salt-thick stew or chewed through jerky like dried bark, a different kind of meal was being served, quietly, behind doors that didn't swing open for just anyone. In the very same buildings where cowboys scraped coins together for cold beans, the elite dined on something unthinkably different. Because even in the dust-choked chaos of the Wild West, those with power carved out their own reality, one where hunger was optional and indulgence never questioned. In the back rooms of select saloons, the ones with curtained-off parlors and velvet chairs worn thin at the edges, bankers leaned over tender steaks, their knives gliding easily through meat that had arrived wrapped in oilcloth, shipped across hundreds of miles in barrels packed with melting ice. Ice itself was a luxury, often delivered from the Rockies or the far north, hacked into massive chunks and stored in sawdust-lined cellars. Most customers never saw it, but the men with silk vests and thick wallets could request it by name, especially when their oysters arrived. Yes, oysters, shucked and briny, kept just cold enough to avoid suspicion. They came in barrels, soaked in seawater, and dreams of far-off coasts. Not many in the town could stomach them, or afford them, but for politicians passing through or local power brokers playing cards in the back, they were a status symbol, a reminder that even in the middle of nowhere, some men still ate like they ruled the world. Pies, too, made their way to these hidden tables. Not the burnt-bottom cornbread pies served to the masses, but sweet apple or berry pies laced with spices and wrapped in golden crusts. The fruit was often canned, brought in on trade wagons at steep cost. Cinnamon and nutmeg came in tins, carefully guarded by the cook like treasure. Cream, if available, was whipped by hand, served cold on delicate porcelain that no one dared chip. The cooks who prepared these meals were usually separate from the ones making slop for the general crowd. They worked in quieter kitchens, with cleaner pans and guarded recipes. Sometimes they were trained. Often, they had simply learned how to please powerful appetites and how to stay silent about what they saw. Because meals at this level weren't just about taste, they were about politics, power, and deals made between bites. A bribe slid across the table. A favor requested over wine imported from the East. A woman sent upstairs after dessert. Everything had a cost, and everything started with a meal. Sheriffs who played their cards right ate well too. They kept the peace or didn't, depending on who was filling their plate. A well-fed lawman was less likely to ask questions about what happened in the alley behind the saloon, less likely to notice which backroom doors stayed locked. In many towns, the badge came with a seat at the private table, and if you were lucky enough to be invited, you didn't ask what was on the menu. You just ate, grateful to be on the right side of the wall. Bordello owners were often among the richest people in town. Their earnings, discreet, steady, and immune to drought or cattle shortages, allowed them luxuries most men couldn't imagine. They hosted dinners that rivaled anything served in eastern cities: roast duck, fresh herbs, imported cheese. They ate like royalty while the rest of the town gnawed on bones. These private feasts never appeared in public ledgers. They weren't spoken of openly, but they existed. They defined the invisible lines between survival and satisfaction, between those who labored and those who merely watched. In the same saloons where boots stuck to beer-stained floors, a second world unfolded, quieter, smoother, polished with money and status. While most prayed for clean bread, a chosen few licked butter from silver knives. And as the piano played in the front room, no one ever looked back to ask who was still hungry. Meat was meat, at least that's what they wanted you to believe. In a Wild West saloon, asking too many questions about what was on your plate wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. You didn't ask where it came from, what kind it was, or how long it had been sitting there. You just ate, or pretended to, because in a place where hunger gnawed louder than suspicion, denial was part of the seasoning. Meat and sauce was a phrase that filled bellies and emptied stomachs. It meant chunks of something, maybe beef, maybe not, boiled or fried or tossed into a thick peppery gravy that masked texture and overpowered taste. It was hot, it was salty, and it was enough to make your brain stop asking questions. But deep down, every man who scraped his spoon across the bottom of that chipped bowl wondered, what exactly did I just eat? The rumors never stopped. Stories passed from town to town, from mouth to mouth, between gulps of cheap whiskey. Some claimed the cook down in Silverton once served raccoon for a week straight and called it prairie chicken. Others swore a saloon in Abilene dished out snake meat after a wagon tipped over and killed half the livestock. There was even a tale of a dog going missing in Deadwood, only to reappear hours later on the special menu. These stories might have been exaggerations, or maybe not, because the truth is, meat was expensive. Cattle had to be raised, slaughtered, transported, butchered, and even then, much of it spoiled along the way. By the time it reached the kitchen of a saloon, half the value was already lost to rot and waste. So, what did a desperate cook do? He got creative. If it walked, crawled, or barked and wasn't nailed down, it had potential. Horse meat wasn't uncommon, especially in frontier towns where riding animals aged out or dropped dead in the heat. No one announced it. It simply replaced beef without comment. Stringy, metallic, hard to chew, but it kept men upright. Some saloons mixed it into stews with onions and black pepper, hoping no one would notice the difference. Most didn't, or they pretended not to. Even wild animals found their way into skillets. Jackrabbits, squirrels, and birds shot with rusty buckshot. In lean seasons, meat from animals found already dead, half frozen, bloated, picked over by flies, was cleaned up, cut thin, and dropped into the pot. If it boiled long enough, the thinking went, it was probably fine. But the fear never truly left the room. Every time a plate clinked down in front of you with mystery sauce and a vague, today's special, you looked at it sideways. You tried to smell past the spices. You took small bites and chewed slowly, hoping for bones that could be recognized, fibers that resembled something familiar. Because once you tasted something strange, once you found a sinewy strip or an oddly shaped piece of cartilage, you couldn't forget it. There were no health inspectors, no labels, no guarantees. The man serving you might have been honest, or he might have been feeding you something even he couldn't name. And if you dared to ask, you'd get a stare. A shrug, maybe a joke. You want to know, or you want to eat? So you learn to keep quiet, to chew fast, to drink faster, and to hope that tomorrow's stew would taste more like beef, and less like the town's missing pet. Because on the frontier, meat wasn't about flavor or ethics. It was about survival, and survival never came with a label. In the Wild West, hunger didn't always send men to the saloon. Thirst did. And not the thirst for clean water or a warm cup of coffee. It was the kind of thirst that settled deep in your bones, born from fatigue, dust, and despair. Alcohol wasn't just a vice. It was routine, ritual, and for many, the only thing on the menu. It filled the belly when food was scarce. It silenced the ache when stew was inedible, and in more cases than most would admit, it replaced dinner altogether. Beer, if you could call it that, was the mildest poison. Brewed in metal tubs behind the bar or hauled in barrels from unreliable sources, it was warm, flat, and thick with sediment. It didn't refresh, it just took the edge off. But it was cheap, and it was something to hold in your hand. If a man was lucky, he might get a glass of it with a crust of bread, not for the sake of pairing, but to keep him from getting sick too quickly. Bread was ballast, a soggy sponge for the rot gut to rest on. Whiskey was stronger, and more dangerous. Not all bottles were whiskey, and not all contents were even drinkable. Some were colored with tobacco juice to simulate aging. Others were cut with kerosene, turpentine, or industrial alcohol to stretch a barrel further. The taste burned the throat, scraped the insides, and left your stomach churning. But for a moment, you forgot you hadn't eaten in days. It made you feel warm, full, maybe even invincible, until it hit your gut like a boot. Some saloons brewed their own spirits. Illegal, unregulated, and barely distinguishable from poison. White lightning, they called it in hushed voices. a liquid fire that could blind a man, drop him where he stood, or send him into a fit of coughing that ended only when he blacked out. Yet still, they drank. Because when the stew was moldy and the beans were crawling, a shot of anything was safer than a spoonful of whatever the cook had left boiling in the back. For many, the meal was ritualized. A shot, then a bite of stale bread. Another shot, then maybe a pickle from a cloudy jar. If you were lucky, the pickle didn't bite back. The bread served no real nutritional purpose. It was there to stop the world from spinning too quickly. It was a thin defense against a very thick problem. Men staggered out of saloons, not just drunk, but ill, vomiting in alleys, collapsing beside troughs, waking up with pounding skulls and empty bellies. And yet, they returned the next night. Because alcohol was easier than questioning what passed for food, easier than facing the taste of spoiled meat or rotten fat. In some towns, it was the only consistent thing available. Not quality, not fairness, just whiskey, bitter, burning, and always there. The saloon became not just a bar, but a feeding station for the hopeless. Not in the sense of nourishment, but in the way a man feeds a fire he knows will burn him. You walked in with a rumble in your stomach and left with a roar in your head. And the next day, you did it again. Because the West didn't care what your body needed. It only offered what it had. And most nights, that meant a bottle full of lies, chased with the dull ache of something that wasn't quite food, and never would be. In the lawless sprawl of the Wild West, the saloon wasn't just a place where fights broke out or bullets flew. It was a quiet battlefield of another kind. One where the enemy didn't wear a gun, but sat on your plate or floated invisibly in your drink. Men died not only from duels and drunken brawls, but from what they swallowed without thinking. Food in the frontier wasn't just bad, it was dangerous, and sometimes it was fatal. Newspapers of the time, when they bothered to report it, told the same story again and again in different towns. A group of miners falls sick after eating stew in a saloon near the canyon. A railroad crew collapses after drinking what they thought was whiskey in a tent bar outside El Paso. A family on the edge of town dies one by one after buying smoked meat from a traveling vendor. And in each case, no one was held responsible. Because there was no law for what went into your mouth. Only luck. Rotten meat was the most common culprit. In the heat, even salted or smoked meat could spoil within days. Cuts from old cattle, sick animals, or even meat scavenged from animals that had already died, were cooked into stews, drenched in thick sauces, and served with a straight face. If it was boiled long enough, it was considered safe. But no amount of boiling could kill every parasite, or disguise every foul stench. Men who dared to ask questions were often told to eat or leave, and many stayed, because the line between hunger and sickness was a thin one, and they were always walking it. Mold grew unchecked in storerooms, on bread, on cheese, even in barrels of pickled vegetables. You could scrape the green fuzz off, sure, but that didn't mean the toxins were gone. In some cases, men were struck by dizziness, blurred vision, or violent illness within hours. In others, it took days for the poison to work through the gut like a slow, bitter reminder. Kitchens didn't have ice boxes. They had shadows and corners where food went to decay. Even mushrooms, those foraged from the wild when supplies ran low, posed their own lethal risks. Not everyone could tell the difference between an edible variety and a toadstool that could shut your organs down before sunrise. Still, they ended up in soups, chopped, boiled, buried under spices. The man who picked them, often someone desperate for a few extra cents. The cook who used them, just hoping to stretch the pot one more day. Alcohol, too, turned deadly more often than anyone admitted. Bootleg spirits mixed with industrial solvents. Kerosene disguised as grain liquor. Bathtub gin thick with methanol. It wasn't rare for a saloon to lose a customer not to a fight, but to what he drank the night before. In one Nevada mining town, a group of 7 men reportedly collapsed after drinking imported whiskey that had been mixed with lamp oil. Only 2 survived. The rest were buried without ceremony, and the saloon reopened the next day, selling the same bottle to new faces. None of this stopped the flow of people through the swinging doors, because hunger made you blind, thirst made you reckless, and poverty made you quiet. You learned to chew slowly, to sniff your glass, to trust your instincts, but even that didn't always save you. The saloon, in all its noise and firelight, looked like a place of life. But under the surface, it was riddled with quiet poisons, served on plates, ladled into bowls, and hidden in brown bottles. It was survival roulette, and every bite was a spin of the chamber. The food didn't kill quickly, it killed casually, indifferently, and worst of all, it killed without leaving a trace. Behind the swinging doors and smoke-filled rooms of a Wild West saloon, the kitchen was often the last place anyone thought to look for a story. And yet, it held some of the darkest, most volatile dramas in the building. The person stirring the pot, mashing the beans, or slicing the questionable meat wasn't always who you might expect. More often than not, it wasn't a burly cook or gruff old man. It was a woman, but not the kind draped in lace or pouring drinks with a wink. These were women pushed to the edge, scraped from the bottom of society's barrel, trying to survive one meal at a time. Widows who'd lost their husbands to gunfire or illness. Women abandoned by men who rode off and never came back. Former workers from the upstairs rooms who could no longer attract customers or had aged out of the trade. They weren't hired for their cooking skills. They were hired because they were cheap, disposable, and had nowhere else to go. They slept in storage closets or upstairs corners, paid in meals and silence, and they learned fast. Cooking in a saloon was as dangerous as serving at the bar, sometimes more. Men wandered into the kitchen drunk, looking for food or worse. Hands groped where they didn't belong. Words were thrown like knives. Sometimes fists followed. The cooks learned to work with blades not just for the stew, but for defense. Hot grease became a weapon. Rolling pins turned into clubs. The kitchen became its own battlefield, one not lit by lanterns but by rage, fear, and the occasional scream swallowed by laughter in the main room. Revenge through food became an unspoken art. A slab of meat left out too long before going to the plate of a particularly cruel customer. A dish oversalted just enough to ruin a gambler's evening. Sometimes, more serious ingredients made their way into meals. Crushed herbs that caused days of nausea, powders that burned the throat. Nothing fatal, nothing obvious, just discomfort, a warning, a way to say, "We remember." The customer never knew who did it, but they rarely caused trouble twice. Still, it wasn't just violence and fear behind the scenes, it was desperation. Every chop of the knife, every stir of the pot was a gamble, a cry for relevance in a world that didn't care. And just when it seemed like the kitchen couldn't sink lower, the world outside found new ways to poison what little was left. Because in the Wild West, even the food had a criminal record. Supply chains were shaky at best, and demand was constant. Saloons turned to backdoor deals and black market ingredients to stay stocked. Butter that wasn't butter, milk stretched with river water or flour paste, cheese molded over, scraped clean, and served anyway. Nothing was wasted, everything was repackaged. If it looked edible, it went on the plate. And if it didn't, someone found a way to make it look edible. Meat past its prime was smoked, rubbed with spices, or drowned in sauces strong enough to kill the smell. Eggs with gray edges were cracked into boiling pans and stirred until no one could tell the difference. Alcohol was colored, relabeled, and sold at full price. Grain liquor, turpentine, and occasionally stolen medicinal spirits sold as aged whiskey. Labels were forged, bottles refilled, and if someone went blind or passed out, the saloon just blamed the customer for drinking too fast. Bribes kept lawmen quiet, a free steak here, a bottle of the good stuff there. In many towns, the sheriff was part of the operation. Sometimes, he was the owner. Other times, he was the one delivering the shipments himself. Everyone had their piece of the pie, even if the pie had been baked with borrowed sugar and rotten fruit. Food wasn't nourishment, it was currency, a tool, a risk. It passed through the hands of criminals, opportunists, and ghosts with nowhere left to hide. And for the customer, it was just a meal. But behind every bite was a network of lies, rot, and deals whispered in back alleys. The saloon didn't need bullets to harm you. Sometimes all it took was a spoon. On the calendar, holidays promised something more, a break from hardship, a table filled with food, maybe even a song if the whiskey hadn't already silenced the room. In the towns of the Wild West, people longed for tradition. A roast on Christmas, a pie on the 4th of July. Something warm, something sweet. Something that reminded them of the places they came from or the lives they once imagined. But dreams spoiled fast out here. And so did the food. The ovens used to bake holiday bread were the same soot-choked fireboxes that burned beans and dried out stew. Temperature control didn't exist. If the fire got too low, meat came out bleeding. If it flared too high, pies turned into lumps of coal. The crusts were black on the outside, raw in the center. Still, they were sliced and served because nothing else was available. No one cared if the apples were fermented or the flour infested with bugs, so long as there was something to chew on. Holidays brought crowds, and crowds brought pressure. Saloons cooked for more mouths than usual, with no extra hands to help. Recipes were stretched thin. A single chicken might be chopped and scattered across 6 plates. Gravy was made from lard and flour water, thickened with desperation. There were cakes once, dense and bitter, baked in pans still lined with bacon grease. In one notorious case, a wedding cake served at a saloon's Christmas party sent 3 guests to bed with metal splinters. The pan had rusted through. No one noticed or cared. Soldiers returning home were often greeted with a feast, but feast was a generous word. The meat, often rushed, barely cooked. The soup served tepid, floating with fat globules that refused to blend. Some towns tried to offer luxury, candied nuts, sugar loaves, even dried figs. But these were rare and rationed. More often they served what they had, and what they had was whatever hadn't rotted yet. Children were sometimes invited in during these occasions, dressed in patched clothes and wide-eyed with hope. They were handed mugs of hot liquid that was neither cider nor broth, but something in between, sweetened with blackstrap molasses, spiked with a drop of whatever spirit hadn't run out. It warmed them, then spun their heads. Even they learned not to ask what was inside. The music played louder on these days, the fire burned longer, but the food, always the food, reminded everyone of where they were, and how far they still had to go to feel human. A burnt crust wasn't just a mistake, it was a metaphor. The party never really reached the mouth. It hovered somewhere between the stomach and the gut. And when the day ended, it faded like all the rest. Leftovers, if any, were thrown to the dogs, plates scraped clean by rats, tables cleared with sighs, not smiles. No one toasted, no one lingered, and the memory, like the taste, dissolved by morning. Then, as quickly as it came, the celebration disappeared into the past. And with it, so did the real flavor of the frontier. Because what remains in the public imagination isn't the bitter coffee or the sour meat. It's the fantasy, served up by Hollywood, polished and plated. Wooden tables gleaming, saloon girls smiling, bartenders sliding plates of roasted chicken across the counter like some Western fairy tale. But the truth was darker, greasier, hungrier. No one remembers the cook with burns on her arms, the boy who chipped his tooth on a biscuit baked too hard, the cowboy who drank bad cider and never got back up. These details were swept away, replaced by amber lighting and staged shootouts. The grit turned to glamour, the rot turned to romance. Today, we speak of saloons like they were the heart of the Old West, warm, raucous, alive. But the real saloons smelled of sweat and mold, of oilcloth and overcooked fat. They fed people, yes, but they fed them just enough to keep them working, drinking, or dying quietly. The true taste of the Wild West was never steak and whiskey. It was ash, salt, rust, and desperation. A taste that clung to your tongue long after the meal, and if you could still remember it, it meant you survived it, but only just.